Good morning. Welcome to McKinley Carter Wealth Services for Your Investments webinar series. My name is Kathleen McDermott, and I am the Director of Nonprofit Advisory Services at McKinley Carter. This is the fourth webinar topic we've presented in the past month. Previous webinars were geared towards our wealth management clients and friends, executives representing our corporate retirement plan clients, another for employees, and today's is geared to our nonprofit clients and friends. Participating, we have executive directors, development directors, board members, volunteers, and donors. So welcome everyone, and thank you for giving us an hour of your very busy days. As a registered investment advisor with the SEC, we are required to let you know that today's presentation is not a solicitation. No performance figures shown are intended to represent a composite, and should you choose to do business with you, we are required to send our disclosure brochure as set forth on our Form ADV. For those of you who don't really know me, I have nearly 30 years of professional nonprofit management, including a CFRE designation. When I joined McKinley Carter, I participated in the Common Funds Endowment Institute. Prior to McKinley Carter, I was a nonprofit executive director, and I also done some consulting for nonprofit organizations, and I'm also involved in the community and sit on numerous boards. Joining me from McKinley Carter is Brian Gongaware. Brian is a principal of the firm. He serves as our Director of Advisory Services. He leads our Pittsburgh office and also serves as our firm's Chief Compliance Officer. Many of you on the webinar will recognize Brian. He works very closely with some of our Pittsburgh nonprofit organizations and is also very involved in the Pittsburgh community and serves on many boards as well. So thank you, Brian, for giving us your time on yet another webinar in the past month.
Good to be with you.
Brian will be providing some of our economic and investment insights today. We've also invited some special guests to partner with us. Arthur and Rich are managing directors at Carter Global. Carter's purpose is to advance philanthropy worldwide by counseling nonprofit organizations in the areas of fundraising, organizational planning, and governance. The Carter team consists of 35 professionals located throughout North America, and 4 of those locally here in Western PA. Both Arthur and Rich have over 30 years of nonprofit experience in the areas of development, philanthropy, strategic thinking, and creative partnerships. Most recently, Arthur served as the VP of Development and Communications for Magee Women Research Institute and Foundation. And most recently, Rich served as the VP and Chief Development Officer for Washington Health System Foundation. So Arthur and Rich, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with our clients and friends some of your expertise, particularly in the areas of fundraising.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Not physically visible on today's webinar, but I know many of our team members are listening in. This team represents 35 individuals in our different locations of Charleston and Wheeling, West Virginia, Pittsburgh and Johnstown, PA, and Gaithersburg, Maryland. For the clients on the webinar, you will recognize those individuals who serve as your primary investment advisor and those support professionals servicing your portfolio. So previously, I mentioned other webinars we have conducted. So obviously, in addition to our nonprofit work, we serve individuals and families in our work at McKinley Carter, as well as corporate retirement plans. All of these clients are throughout the country, 34 states, and even 3 countries abroad. And combined, we manage over $1 billion in assets. So our goal today is to overview a couple of different areas that have been in the news, given this COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we are not really going to cover health and safety concerns, but all of us giving the webinar and everyone in both of our families at Carter Global and at McKinley Carter wish you, your friends, family, and colleagues continued health and safety, particularly as many of our communities begin to reopen. So items 2 and 3 that you see on the screen today are those areas where we will primarily focus. We'll be looking at what has happened in the last 3 months and how this can affect an organization's outlook. And then we will also address those smart actions that you can take now and into the future to protect your nonprofit's sustainability in the wake of COVID-19. We will conclude with a Q&A session. And so as questions arise, please use the question box to the right of your screen. We will attempt to answer as many of these as possible, but if we're not able to get to all of them today, you can certainly expect to hear from us by email so we can get you an answer to your question. So let's move ahead. And Brian, why don't you begin and let us know what has happened over the last 3 months in our economy?
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for that introduction and the opportunity to address this group of executives, leaders, board members, people that are really contributing to our community in such really important ways, who are also trying to navigate these challenging times. And so a lot of the questions in which we're going to talk about today are actual questions that we've been getting from organizations and individuals and leaders that we work with. And so the first one here, what happened during the past 3 months, is I know that so many people have been focused on the immediacy and survival and meeting the needs in the community and fulfilling a vision and a mission, is that some of the things that I'm going to take an opportunity to talk for just a couple of minutes about are the things that have been happening alongside. And so when we take a look at the financial investment markets, you know, a lot has happened, of course. The stay-at-home orders, the past couple of months worth of that, uncertainty about how long and what the depth of the impact might be, have all been contributors to that. But one of the ones in which I'll focus on for a second here is this bear market, as we refer to it, as that has happened in the stock market. The reference here in the subtitle is the S&P 500. For those who might not be as aware, the S&P 500 or Standard & Poor's 500 is an index. It's a gathering of the 500 largest US companies, and it looks at their stock price and their stock price movement of the 500 largest US companies. It's a great barometer for, you know, how are our companies performing and how are the value of companies moving over time. Well, during the depths of this downturn from February the 19th until March 23rd, the 500 largest US companies declined in value 34% when you put them all together. 34% from February 19th to March 23rd is historic in terms of the depth as well as the tightness, how it was compressed, and it happened in such a short period of time. Now, the good news of this is that they've recovered about 30% since then, since March 23rd, that bottom that we experienced. A couple of takeaways that I would share with you is that one is how quickly this all unfolded. Things were moving along rather normally as we went through January and the first half of February. But it's normal in society and in investing is that sometimes the emotions, fear in this example, can affect your outlook and therefore cause you to change an approach. Now, with nonprofit organizations that may have investment policy statements, we would hope, and some guidelines and some ranges that the rationale or the discipline might be there to be less captured by things like emotions. We're all in the human at the end of the day, and we'll talk about that as well as the impact of your changing organizational needs in challenging times like this. And it certainly reinforces for us once again, because it happened in such a short time period, the importance of preparedness in advance. What happens if we were to experience a type of a decline? How do we prepare the resources that we have as a nonprofit organization so that we're not a victim of something that we can't control or necessarily diversify away? But history tells us that these kind of declines happen all the time. And so this particular picture just takes a look at the gray columns is what was the investment return of the 500 largest US companies, that same measure, the S&P 500, for the calendar year of 1980, where we put the cursor there of If you invested on January 1st and came back on December 31st, you were positive 26%. That's a pretty good year. What the red dots represent is what was the biggest decline during the year, the intra-year decline of 17%. It was a bad March, April, May, or bad September and October. So you have to endure those red dots that happen pretty much every year as we look back at this since 1980 in order to experience the calendar year positive return. So volatility is part of the trade-off that we have, and as the subtitle refers to, is that the returns have been positive 30 of the last 40 years, despite those intra-year average declines of 13.8%. So in building out a portfolio or counseling a nonprofit organization in terms of the mix of assets that one has, or how aggressive or how conservative to be, the time horizon that one might have, is you've got to build these into consideration to be a little bit all-weather. What we experience in this short time period, as you saw already, is this year's red dot event of the minus 34%, and hopefully that becomes the lowest that we experienced during this year, but it's not out of the norm, and so therefore you've got to prepare for it. Now, this isn't the worst overall decline, but as we already addressed, it certainly hit us hard and fast. And so when we look at the next slide in the conclusion of this particular section, this looks at the 5 biggest declines we've had over the past 100 years. We've just highlighted 5 of those historic returns in these 5 columns. And we can see by the date time periods here, sometimes they lasted over 2 or 3 or even 5 years of time. We had a 5-week decline in our particular circumstance so far. But we look at the magnitude of the decline during those 2, 3, 5 years and the different time periods in which those happened, we see just how dramatic it was. We certainly hope that this isn't a repeat of those. But what we see is that sharp recoveries frequently come after some of the sharpest declines that we've had. And so if you look across the first row, that was the investment return the next 365 days. So coming off of some of the worst downturns, we've had some of the best recoveries. And the first year average recovery after these 5 sharpest declines has been almost 71% on average for these 5 time periods. We'd love that to be the experience this time. We don't know that it will be, but just kind of gives us some perspective as we look at this on a historical basis. And when we stretch it out even further over 5 years, the 5-year average return, as you see there on the bottom right, ends up being something like 23+%, which is extraordinary, and we would certainly take as above average. So those sharp recoveries follow some of the sharpest declines. And so in order to experience the recovery is that you need to stay in, and you need to stay in with your discipline. Another key takeaway from this is that sometimes these downturns can last for longer periods of time. And so how important it is in a sort of bucketing strategy, as we refer to it, is to have 3 to 5 years worth of withdrawals in other investments and things like cash reserves and then fixed income. Those kind of discussions are unique to a particular organization, but this is just another reminder that, of how important it is to have those cash reserves held and fixed income for those near-term withdrawals. So all this has certainly had an impact as we think about, affected our outlook. We've just gone through such a traumatic time from an economic and investment standpoint, but what's it look like now as we start to go out from here? Just a couple of slides to share with you on that front. And one that we always look to is the U.S. leading economic indicators. They give us a little bit of insight in terms of maybe what might be anticipated going forward. And leading economic indicators are things like manufacturing activity, it's business and consumer confidence, it's building permits would all be included as some of these measures that you have here. We see just how it's changed over time, and the gray shaded columns are past recessions that we've had. And so we see the importance of it, of that sometimes when we see these leading economic indicators start to turn down, as it can be a forecaster, a predictor of a future recession. It's not 100%, but certainly something that we look to and keep an eye on. Well, what we see over this time period is we are marching right along over the past 12 months until we hit March. And it was actually just earlier today is that our more recent announcement was made in terms of this level. At 10 a.m. today, we had the April announcement, and it actually showed further declines. And so you see the scale here on the left, Today's announcement was at 98.8, or down another 4.4% from March, an extension of this down for another time period. As is no surprise to any of us, is that we're probably in for a little more of a challenging time going forward over the next several quarters, potentially, as the economy adjusts. But when we look at things in terms of what the expectations are for profitability and for companies, there are some high expectations that are right now out there in the marketplace. And if I just highlight a couple of these in closing out this portion, is the S&P 500, again, those 500 largest US companies are captured in this very top section. And the expectation is that earnings or profitability of companies, earnings per share change year over year, are expected to be down sharply here in 2020, as you see almost 22%. Revenue or sales to be down nearly 7%. These are the best forecasts that exist right now. Of course, as we go through the coming weeks and quarters and we understand how businesses and states are opening up, is that we'll get even more refined of a read on these kind of things. When we look at 2021, what's now expected for next year, now of course these would be earnings comparing 21 compared to 20, so easier comparisons. There's a expectation of a reacceleration, if you will, in terms of corporate profitability. The next section, S&P 600, is a measure of 600 small companies. So first was large companies, now we're looking at small companies, and we see a more dramatic downturn with a potentially more dramatic recovery. EAFE, EAFE, refers to international measures, the international developed economies like Europe and Japan. EM are emerging markets. So we actually see, flat performance in 2020 compared to 2019, with also very strong expectations in 2021. All this is yet to, of course, play out, but is a little bit of early indications in terms of the pace and the strength of a potential economic and or investment recovery in the coming months and quarters. So all this can seem rather straightforward and disciplined and rational. Stick to it. But we also know that the emotions can be part of this, even if it's a matter within a committee who might be looking at things and might be hearing from leadership in terms of what the needs might be. And so it's just a reminder of how emotions can impact investment returns. And so we all can go through these sort of cycles of optimism that can lead, of course, to high expectation, or in this phrase, it refers to it as greed, or nervousness can turn to fear and optimism. And part of the challenge is that we go through different times is how are we positioning ourselves? Are we getting captured by one of these emotions and therefore taking on more risk or getting more conservative at the wrong time? CNN actually took this and they created a fear and greed index by which they measure, overall the swings that happen in these periods of high emotion. At the beginning of the year, we were actually at some very high levels of great confidence as we were early into 2020. Obviously, that changed rather dramatically, and now we're around the low 40 kind of a rating on this. But a question that we've actually had from a number of people is, well, would it actually just hurt to sit out for a few weeks or months? We've heard it from individuals, we've heard it from nonprofit organizations and finance committees or foundation boards to say, would this just be prudent for us to do? And it reminds us then of a slide that we look at, which takes a look back over the past 20 years. From the very beginning of 2000 and through December 31st of 2019. And the US stock market, again, the S&P 500 is the measurement here, has been averages per year of a little over 6%. If we had sat out and if we missed the 10 best days, our return gets cut in half. We're now at an average of 2.44% per year. If we had missed just the best 20 days over the 5,000 plus trading days that happened over these 20 years, you're essentially 0% return as a result. And so the risk there is that you miss some of those 10 best days. And you say, well, how could those even happen, in times like this? I'll just zoom in here a little bit to the inset box that 6 of the 10 best days happen within 2 weeks, just 10 days of business activity of the 10 worst days. And back in 2015, August 26th was only 2 days after the worst day of August 24th. We experienced a little bit of that here in March, in our own country in this own particular example. So those kind of turnarounds can happen rather quickly, and that's some of the risk of sitting out or selling even for just a fairly short period of time. So with all that as a way of a backdrop, as I think about how this relates to our nonprofit listeners and the audience for today. And so when I think about a report that Giving USA puts out in their annual statistics, is it looks in this particular example at total giving. And their total giving was $427 billion in 2018, which was just a little less than a 1% increase from the prior year. But that total giving has increased every year since 1978, with the exception of just 3 years, 1987, historic downturn in the market, 2008 and 2009, the Great Recession years. And since the end of the Great Recession of 2009, from 2009 to 2018, we've seen a 33% increase in giving from the bottom that we experienced back here in 2009. Rather tremendous, of a 33% increase over that time period, coming out of what we all recall as one of the biggest downturns that we had ever experienced. And so total giving continues. Now, there is a correlation that we've seen. Research has a statistically significant correlation between what's happening in the stock market and giving. And so the yellow being that same S&P 500 over time, and the blue being the total giving. And so what we see is that giving may not be as robust if we have a sharp decline in the stock market like we had in 2008, but it's still there. There's a resiliency to the giving that continues. And so what we would encourage, and where we're going to transition from the conversation now, is that now is not a time to be more cautious. If anything, there's even more opportunity for you from a nonprofit organization standpoint. We do see the correlation, but that the giving continues even through times like this.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for sharing the Giving USA statistics, which I think are optimistic, and also for giving us a look at what's happened in the economy. So now we'll turn to some of those things organizations can do to plan for the future. So we'll start with Rich and Arthur on fundraising.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Our first slide, we'll take a look at a pie chart from Giving USA. And the only point I want to make here is that as we focus on how do we engage our donors and those who love our organizations, take a look at the 68% of individuals are making up the $427 billion given in 2018, and another 9% come through bequests. So, and then you look at the foundations at 18%, some of them are probably family foundations. So when you take that and add that up, you've got almost 80%, 77 to 80% for sure, of that $427 billion coming from individuals. So as we focus on what we're going to talk about, just remember, focus on individuals. The foundations are getting a lot of press right now, and they're doing wonderful things for recovery. But we're going to challenge you to work with your individuals and use this time to really improve your relationships with them. The next slide that we want to take a look at, and everyone of this organization, they're all talking about different kinds of organizations, but just take a look at this chart, see where you are, and what percentage of the take your type organization gets. And it just is kind of a helpful guide. Giving USA does this annually, and I'd suggest this is one of the benchmark studies you should look at annually as an organization. Now I want to turn it over to Rich, who's going to walk us through some smart actions, and please think of some questions.
Thanks, Arthur. The next part of our presentation focuses on 6 areas in which we think smart actions on the part of our clients is very important. I'm going to cover the first 3 and then turn it back over to Arthur. The first area of our concern is on COVID messaging. Organizations, we stress that you need to continue to understand that your donors care about you and they want to help you during this time of crisis. But in order for them to do that, you need to have an effective communication plan that communicates with them. You need to emphasize how you've been impacted by COVID-19 and what you're doing to address the impact of that. We have a lot of our clients who are healthcare related, so I'll use them as an example. Healthcare industries have been almost decimated in their revenue stream. They've lost elective surgeries, normal hospital stays have been delayed, diagnostic testing is not taking place. They've been saddled with extra costs to procure PPEs to help treat the COVID virus that they didn't have budgeted for. So their bottom lines are being impacted tremendously. And those funds are used to support services in the community and outreach programs. If they're not able to generate support from the community, some of those programs are either going to go away or be drastically reduced. Another smart action, though, is even though you're focusing on COVID fundraising, we encourage our clients to continue to focus on your core mission. That's why the donors are there in the first place. They may be responding to a need for COVID fundraising, but the reason they're there is for your core mission. So we really encourage our clients to continue to focus on that and keep it in the forefront. The second area that we talk about with smart actions is crisis fundraising. Identifying and promoting programs that you have and needs that your organization has that are related to COVID-19 is a very important step. It helps you to crystallize your fundraising, but it also gives your donors something concrete to envision that their money is supporting. So it helps you in that regard. We also think a smart move is to put a face on your fundraising. By that, we mean focus on the people that are going to benefit from what comes in, not the things that are procured. And again, using the example of a healthcare organization, focus on the 100 frontline healthcare providers who now have adequate face shields and face masks to safely perform their duties, and not the 3,000 masks and face shields that were donated. We recommend that our clients make impactful, emotional, and specific asks for immediate needs. Another example is we had a mental health agency that in the beginning of the pandemic realized that their clients were in distress because they couldn't access their appointments. They couldn't get in. So they put out a call for support to their supporters to enhance their telehealth capability, and in some cases to even buy devices that could be given to their clients so they could keep their appointments. And it was a very successful appeal. They responded to that immediate need, and it was an emotional need. We also want to make sure that a smart action is to use all modes of communication when doing your fundraising, all social platforms, direct mail, and in particular, personal calls. And we think this is extremely important when dealing with your major gift donors. It really strengthens the relationship, and they want to hear from you. So it's a good way to reconnect with them. The third area for smart action, and I feel very strongly about this, is plan for a transition back to your normal fundraising. Most organizations are so focused on raising funds for the current crisis that all their efforts are devoted there. Their donors are hearing nothing but crisis fundraising, both from that organization but others. And the difficulty is that it's going to be difficult if there isn't a plan to transition the donor back to supporting your core mission. So we really think that there needs to be a proactive decision on your part to develop a strategic plan to transition from your crisis fundraising to normal fundraising. Once that plan is developed, we really encourage our clients to share that plan with their development committee or their board, both for their input, but also for their buy-in so that they can support it. And then another key step that we think is important is when you're implementing this transition plan, make sure that you intertwine within your core mission, messaging, and fundraising the role that your organization played in COVID-19. And we're encouraging this because we're being told that at some point it's going to reoccur. And if you continue to intertwine, if that reoccurrence happens, you're going to be able to transition back to crisis fundraising as well as your core mission fundraising. I'll use the example of hospitals again. Their message should be, we were here to help keep the community safe, to diagnose whether you had it, to treat those people and save lives for the people who did, and to keep the community safe. If it reoccurs, we need to be strong, so we need your support. So with that, I'll turn it over to Arthur to handle the next areas.
Thanks so much, Rich. And I will also cover 3 bullet points in this section. And the first one is going to be increased personalized communications. Right now, what we're seeing is organizations really want to reach out, but they're not exactly sure how. So what we're recommending is they develop a script, and then they develop a list of people they want to call. We're calling them care calls. Donors care about your organization, but having an organized script allows you to send a consistent message out, and also gives you the ability to recruit senior leaders of your organization and or volunteers or board members to help you make some of those phone calls. It's really important you have a single voice, and it's out there, and it's positive, and it's hopeful on how your organization is really having a laser focus on their mission and how it's changed just a bit during this pandemic. The second area is really to use videos. What we're seeing is videos right now are being, very, very easily done, low budget. Video from your executive director or your board chair going out an email on a weekly basis really keeps your donors up to speed with what's going on with your organization. The second smart action I want to talk about are special events. We all are involved with special events. Some organizations are taking this opportunity to postpone their event. If they have a May event, they're talking about postponing it till August or September or October. What's the upside of that? Well, it moves it down the road. The downside from our view is if you need that money in this fiscal year, how are you going to make it up? How are you going to make up that needed money for your mission and your budgets? So take a good look at what your gross is for that event and what your net is, so that you really know at the bottom line what you need to raise to keep your budget in line with the needs of your organization. Some organizations are going virtually, and right now, this week, there are many virtual events. So if you're going that way and you want to have an event in the fall, you may want to be studying the virtual events that are taking place today and see what works, see what fits within your organization. Every organization is different. So take the time to invest in learning what is working in the new virtual world that we live in. And the final comment I will make on special events, some organizations tend to get event heavy. And this is a real opportunity to cancel some of your events permanently. Make sure you study the return on an investment an event does for your organization. They're labor intensive. They sometimes can have a high cost to return ratio. And now may be the time to combine a couple of events or eliminate some events and focus more time working with your individuals and getting face-to-face meetings and asking people for money from the individuals that you care about the most. So the third point I want to talk about today is organizational development review. This is a time that when I'm working with my partners and my clients, I'm really challenging them to take a look at their internal workings. Number one, your donor database. It is overlooked many times for organizations. It is a key component of your development and communication plan. Take this time to work on your donor database. Go in there. What are we working on? What information do we have? Is it correct? Use this time to be working on your donor database. 2, review your major gift program. Who are your major donors? what kind of a plan do you have in place over 12 months to engage them, to educate them, to bring them closer to your organization, and at the appropriate time, ask them for the right gift? Moves management is something that a lot of organizations talk about and they never get to. What are your strategic moves with your most important donors, and how do we engage others to help us successfully? Third, look at your mailings. We spend a lot of money putting things in the mail. Are your mailings working? Is there a good return on investment? What is your acquisition rate? What is working, what is not? Take this opportunity to shave the things that are not working and add to those that are working. How do you use social media to support a snail mail campaign? Test those kinds of things. Now's the time to take a look at that. It's also time to take a look at rewriting some of those things. Don't use the annual campaign appeal that you've used the last 5 years. Take the time to freshen it. Take this opportunity to gather stories of impact that your organization has had and incorporate those in your social media and your mail and your newsletters. Take this opportunity. Also, this is a tough one, but take the opportunity to evaluate your development team. Are they performing at a high level? If they are, great. If not, how can we tweak them? Quite frankly, how can we support them? In development, we don't do a good enough job in continuing education. This is a great opportunity to get more education for your development team so they can perform at a higher level. Most development officers really want to help. Sometimes a little more education and structure around that can make them more effective for your organization. So invest in some time to make your professional development team even more effective. And then I agree with Rich and others that have said this. We need to start a communication plan for the transition. This just can't happen. It has to be planned out thoughtfully. What does it mean for your organization post-COVID-19? How does your mission is affected by post-COVID-19? What does that look like? And what are you doing to prepare for that right now? And then I think finally, the thing that I'd like to emphasize is we've got to give hope in our communications. We know that these are going to be tough times. We know coming out of this are going to be a challenge, but give your donors hope that you are an organization that is prepared and that is ready. And the organizations that do these things that we've just spoken out, when the transition is happening and it has happened, those organizations will be raising money while other organizations will be sitting around saying, hey, it's over. What should we do now? And I want to make sure your organization is the former and not the latter. And I'll turn it back over to Kathleen and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Rich. I too can't wait until we're saying it's over and look at all the great things that we can do, not only within our organizations, but for the constituencies in which we serve. Take a quick minute to remind you to submit your questions. We've gotten a few already, so we'll get to those after we talk about smart actions as they relate to finance. So obviously it goes without saying, financial implications of what has happened have been really significant, and especially significant for our nonprofit organizations. The first point is around emergency grants. I know many of you have applied for them, but my understanding is there could be a second round of emergency funding coming from community-based foundations and other private organizations. So just don't put it behind you. Kind of keep your eyes open for those announcements for a new round of emergency grants. Brian talked a little bit in his section about reserve funds. So many organizations have reserves, some invested in the market, some not. And reserves are put aside for that rainy day. And I certainly think what we have experienced constitutes that rainy day or that emergency situation. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable for you and your board to sit down and talk about how you might access your reserve funds. I think it's important for you and your board to know what you have, what those reserves will cover, and for how long. Are you going to use your reserves to help with the deficit situation? You might consider using reserves for seed money for costly programs that are in development that could create a new stream of revenue for your organization. And last but not least, very important to your conversations around, are you going to replace the funds and how? So with all of this, hopefully you have a reserves policy in place that has already defined some of these recommendations, but if you do not, I think it's really important to put one in place. Should something happen in the future, you have a time-tested document to go back to. The next section is around an endowment, and this one can be tricky as well. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about restricted funds, but what I want to focus on here are those unrestricted endowment funds. So many organizations get unrestricted gifts and bequests that go into an endowment. Sometimes they stay unrestricted. Sometimes the board will define how those funds should be used, and that really constitutes an unrestricted endowment. So if your board has restricted it, then by all means, it goes back to the board to determine if any of those funds could be accessed. I would go to your investment policy statement. The spending policy in your investment policy statement should define how the funds can be used, if they can be used in emergency situations. So I think a lot of decision making there is also really important. Many organizations are looking to borrow from the endowment rather than taking out loans. And a lot of this I know you guys are familiar with, but I would document everything and include the reasons you're making those changes. Also, consider a time frame for when the original spending policy goes back to its original form. And also, if you're doing any borrowing, the conditions for borrowing, the time frame, and how you're going to repay those funds back into your endowment. And last but not least, certainly if you work with an investment advisor, a CPA, reach out to those experts. They can certainly help you through a lot of these conversations. So if you do have restricted gifts or grants, and it's a last resort, I certainly wouldn't go there unless absolutely necessary, because restricted gifts are legally binding. If you're able to get donor consent, if your donor is living, that would certainly be a possibility. Again, last resort, but I would take a very strong case for support to your donor. And if they are in favor of accessing those funds, document that request and any conditions around utilizing those funds. So donors who are deceased, there are laws in place that govern restricted funds. Those are usually through the Uniform Prudent Management and the Institutional Investment Act. And so these laws vary state by state. So I'm not an attorney and I don't really keep up with the legislation much, but in general, funds that are more than 20 years old with a value less than a certain amount could be tapped into, and again, depending on your state's regulations. Again, last resort, but honestly, it might be worthwhile to consider that for really small restricted funds that support programs that really no longer reflect your mission, or for funds that are so small in nature that the annual proceeds from those funds really don't make a meaningful difference on the work that you're doing. Organizations who are in a capital campaign, I've heard this question quite a lot. What do we do? Well, I think in this instance, it depends on the stage that you're in. If you have not done a feasibility study yet, but you're looking to do that, I would maybe defer that for a little while until donor sentiment is a little bit stronger. They're feeling a little bit better about the economy, because I think if you were to do your feasibility study now, you might get a little skittishness from your donors. If you're in the silent phase, I would continue, maybe extend your timeline. Generally, these donors probably still have the capacity to give, but might need a little bit more time. If they're planning on making a gift of stock, they might want to wait until there's a little bit more recovery in the economy to make that gift. If you're at the end of your campaign, in the public phase, you might have a little bit of difficulty. As we all know, this is the most difficult part of the campaign. Lots of donors, smaller gifts. These donors may not have as much capacity to give. And, I think extending a public phase could be in your favor. You really don't want your campaign to stall. So I would regardless revisit that feasibility study when you're considering your capital campaign. So the last set of SMART actions focus around planning. And the first bullet kind of talks a little bit about what Arthur was addressing in using your stay-at-home time wisely. Arthur talked about databases and revisiting annual appeal letters and your development plan. I think it's also a great time to think about what future programming might look like. You know, most organizations have a lot of ideas of things that they would like to do. So, you know, kind of dust those things off the shelf and see how they might fit into your strategic plan. So that's the next section here. You know, what do we do about our strategic plan? I would definitely revisit it, look at your timelines. Do those timelines need to be readjusted? The next bullet talks a little bit about, you know, potentially tabling programs that require significant financial capital. If you have those types of programs in your plan, you know, like I said, you know, edit that timeline and, you know, see where it fits and what resources are required. But also, you know, I think this is a time where change is possible. Things are probably going to look different, you know, regardless when we're coming out of this. So have your wish list of programs, and for those things that are not too costly or too high risk, try new ways of doing things. I think that's a great way to breathe life into your mission and to bring new people into your organization and potentially new donors. And last but not least, this really touches on finance as well. I think it's really important for organizations to engage in scenario planning, looking at the short term, the midterm, and the long term. I highly recommend creating sort of a best case scenario and a worst case scenario for your fiscal year 21 budget. You know, being really flexible, and a way to start this would be potentially to look at your biggest ticket items, both on the revenue side and the expense side, and test out some modeling on worst and best case scenarios for those really high ticket things that you do. So we're nearing that Q&A time. I see a few that are coming in. I'm going to turn it back to Brian just for a few minutes on some closing remarks, and then we'll address our questions.
Thanks so much, Kathleen and Arthur and Rich for sharing those really terrific, smart and insightful SMART actions in those three different areas. And I know that in thinking about those and some of the organizations that I'm personally involved with and am passionate about, is it could absolutely leave you saying, oh, where do I begin? I've got more questions now, having experienced the past 45 minutes than I had when we started, or you created some other areas for me to even be thinking about. And we can certainly become overwhelmed in that regard. And I think it's really a matter of the importance of simplifying things. Is that, you know, not many organizations have the bandwidth to be able to take on all things at one time. But, you know, a graphic that we sometimes use just takes a look at these different areas of investments or finance or fundraising or planning. And I think the way that you guys organize the presentation of each one of those disciplines, essentially having a page in this area, you know, what are some of the possibilities that we can do versus trying to do all of it at once. And so let's take an organized, simplistic way of approaching each of these different areas. And it may be a matter of some small groups or subcommittees in a particular area to take some of those on. And so thank all three of you for that. And I know from our standpoint is the four of us in preparing for our discussion today, always look forward to sharing some of our experiences and real life organizations that we've helped and worked with over time and sort of navigate. But we love to field any questions that have come about with this group over the next time that we've got. Kathleen, any you want to share?
Sure. So I'm going to pass this one to Arthur and Rich. And the question is, what is the role of the board during this time?
Thanks, Kathleen. The role of the board is critical. I mean, obviously they're your governing organization, but the role of the board is also to be your ambassadors. So by training them to bring them involved either in the care calls, or using this opportunity for them to share on social media what is going on with your organization, I think are just two good ways that you can involve the board right now. They want to do something, give them a very specific task, and then make sure they report back to you on what they're hearing from who they communicate with.
Yeah, I just piggyback on what Arthur said. I have a client of ours whose board members were so passionate about the organization was a healthcare organization and what they were confronting that they actually came in and made the personal phone calls to the major gift donors, explaining what the organization was doing and then articulating how they could help. Was very successful in generating, in fact, increased gifts than they normally would have expected at that time of the year. So it's a very key role.
And as a follow-up to both of you, again, this is somewhat similar. Should organizations be doing anything new or different to make volunteers feel safe in working for their organization in a post-COVID world?
That's a great question, Kathleen. People have to feel very confident and safe to re-engage, and everyone's got to make that intelligent decision themselves. If they feel that the organization is doing everything possible and you should be articulating what you're doing, then I think volunteers who are healthy and their immune system is in good shape will be re-engaging. Those that do not feel safe because of a pre-existing condition, let's try to find a role for them. With the virtual world, is there a role that they can play within your organization, but they can stay safe at home while we figure out how to handle this virus?
Again, just to piggyback, I think it depends a lot on the organization. I know a lot of healthcare organizations, a lot of their volunteers are of the age that are particularly susceptible to COVID-19. So having them on site is not an option. But a lot of organizations are looking at alternative ways to help fulfill the mission remotely and using their volunteer time without having to come in to the organization. So be creative in how you do that and innovative because you don't want to lose contact with your volunteers. They're committed to what you do. And in most cases, not only do they volunteer their time, they also support financially.
Okay. I'll take this next one. We were in the home stretch of completing our next 3-year strategic plan for fiscal year 21 to 23. Do we move forward as planned, or does the new plan need to reflect our short-term reactions to the impact of the coronavirus? So what I think I would do is I would take a look at that 3-year plan and extract those initiatives for the coming year that you think are doable. And then to those, I would add your tactics for response to COVID and kind of pull it out and establish an annual plan, like a 1-year annual plan, keeping everything else in place and addressing those things as you can. But then, after that year, then flip over to that new plan, maybe extend it out another year. But I mean, unless there's anything in that 3-year plan that seems completely unrealistic, I would move forward, but pull out some things to do on an annual basis.
Kathleen, if I can, on that, Kathleen, is that one of the things that I've seen, and I think goes back to your planning slide on that example that I would really encourage is that scenario planning. When you think about a 3-year time period of 2021, 22, and 23, there's a lot of different directions in which things might play out. And so, even putting things into phases, whether it's a calendar year or, between now and next February, whatever those things might be. And then if these things were to happen, this is where the scenario we would see and how we would see it playing out and what the result and impact and actions on behalf of our organization might be. And then what if things go route 2 or route 3 or route 4 can be the real value from that in that during rational times, we think about scenarios and our actions, our reactions to things. I've seen you do it. I've seen other organizations do it.
Brian froze up for me. I don't know if everybody else noticed that, but I'll add to that. Scenario planning is going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be something you've probably never done. I think, though, it's so important to work through it. This is the way maybe you can use your board. If you have, accountants and CPAs, they should actually be able to help you on the budgeting side of things. So I'm really a strong proponent of that. I'm going to address this next question, but also look to Arthur and Rich for some support here. The question is, are there any specific SMART actions for performing arts organizations? Earned revenue has disappeared and that there are no performances. Yes, and I know this is really difficult because there's also a lot of uncertainty as to when you can bring people together, whether it's a theater or a concert hall. And if you do that, can you have your capacity of 500? Probably not, because you're going to have to social distance. So one of the things that I would recommend is to look at ways that you can deliver performances in smaller venues. If you have an orchestra, are there ways that you can bring ensembles out of the orchestra and do smaller venue performances? To the extent that maybe you can do some things outdoors, that would be a possibility as well. And I think, again, in this instance, I think that scenario planning is important. So, knowing that we have a play in October, right now, maybe we could do it. So what does that look like if we're able to do it like we used to be able to do it? What does it look like if we're not able to do it? And then what does it look like if we're able to do something in a modified way? Arthur, Rich, are there any suggestions that you would have?
Sure, Kathleen, I'll start. A couple of suggestions. One might be to use your social media right now to thank your donors with virtual performances that are private for some of your donors. That's very special. The other thing is being part of the community. Make sure you stay relevant during this time. We know that you're closed and we feel terrible about it, but stay relevant. Be part of the community. Support the food bank in doing a concert. Talk about the wonderful things that are happening in the community and that you're still there. Maybe this you call this is an intermission and we'll be back. But until then, let's support our friends. Make sure they have food. Make sure they have shelter. So stay relevant in the conversation right now. We're all thinking about them, but we know that there are other things that have to happen first before we're going to enjoy a good symphony again in a live performance.
And my suggestion would be to connect with your peers in the region and throughout the country. I'm on a healthcare peer network, and we talk every 2 weeks. And the innovativeness and the creativeness that's coming out and is shared with the group is very inspiring, and I think it helps people. So don't feel like you're on an island. Connect with your peers, and I think collectively solutions will come up, whatever they are.
And I think I can answer the very last question very quickly and transition to our close. The question is if we have any best practices regarding reserve policies that we can share. And yes, actually, we do have a variety of templates for different things like reserve policies, investment policy statements, gift designation policies. So yes, absolutely. I can share that out to the person that asked the question. But at any time, if any of you have any questions, concerns, all of us on this webinar are happy to respond, to share our resources with you so we can get through this together. So Brian, do we have some final slides?
Sure. Just as a reminder of some of the things that we continue to do from a resource standpoint is through our own website. I certainly encourage people to visit that. Where we continue to update a variety of different COVID-19 resources, like some of the things we talked about, as well as some other things that might just be valuable for different people impacted. And then certainly our contact information, as Kathleen mentioned, is that we're here to be a resource for you, serve those who we serve, also serve our community. and our community at large. And we do that through physical locations in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, but we also do it throughout the country. And so we appreciate this opportunity to join you today. As Kathleen mentioned, I serve as Chief Compliance Officer of the firm. So of course, we've got to have a small print, the final page here, and that today's presentation was for information and planning purposes and not a solicitation for services. But we greatly appreciate the opportunity for the four of us to spend time with you today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.